What if everything you've been told about the birth of great civilizations was a carefully crafted illusion? Picture this: the mighty Roman Empire, stretching its golden eagles across continents, claiming descent from the gods themselves through the legendary hero Aeneas. Or the Persian kings, weaving tales of divine favor to justify their rule over vast lands. These weren't just stories, they were masterpieces of political theater designed to rewrite history itself. Why would empires go to such lengths to reshape their own creation myths? The answer lies in what we might call the mythic blueprints of power, elaborate narratives spun not just to explain origins, but to control them. Think about it. Every civilization has a founding story, a tale of how it came to be. But what happens when those stories aren't just folklore, but tools of domination? Imagine a ruler standing before their people, proclaiming, "This is who we are, and this is why we must rule." It's more than propaganda, it's a psychological grip on collective memory. From the pharaohs of Egypt linking themselves to the sun god Ra, to the Aztecs reframing their rise as destiny written in the stars, these weren't accidents. They were deliberate acts of narrative engineering, reshaping reality to fit ambition. And the chilling truth, this game of myth-making didn't end with ancient empires. It's a playbook still in use today. So how did they do it? How did empires turn myth into a weapon? And why does it matter to us now? That's the journey we're about to take, a deep dive into the shadowy intersection of storytelling and power. We'll unravel how rulers manipulated creation tales to silence dissent, justify conquest, and even erase rival cultures from history. You'll discover the hidden fingerprints of propaganda in the most sacred of texts, and see how the past was weaponized to control the present. But this isn't just about ancient kings and long-faded empires. It's about understanding the stories we're still being told and who benefits from them. Because when you know how myths are made, you'll never look at history or the world around you the same way again. Myths are far more than bedtime stories or ancient curiosities. They're the invisible scaffolding holding up entire civilizations. At their core, these narratives answer the most human of questions. Who are we? Where do we come from? But when empires seize those questions, the answers become weapons. Take Rome's Aeneid, Virgil's epic masterpiece commissioned by Emperor Augustus. On the surface, it's a thrilling saga of the Trojan hero Aeneas fleeing burning Troy to found a new homeland. But read between the lines, and it's a blatant propaganda tool, stitching Augustus's reign into the fabric of divine destiny. By linking himself to Aeneas, and by extension, to the goddess Venus, Augustus didn't just celebrate his rule. He made it inevitable. This isn't unique to Rome. Across history, rulers have understood that controlling a people's past means controlling their future. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs didn't just claim authority, they became gods on earth, their bloodlines tracing back to Ra himself. The message was clear: challenge the king, and you challenge the cosmos. Meanwhile, in Persia, kings like Darius I carved their legitimacy into cliff faces, proclaiming their rise was ordained by Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity. These weren't humble origin stories, they were cosmic job applications approved by the divine. But why go to such lengths? Because myths don't just describe power, they create it. A shared story binds people together, giving them a common identity and a reason to obey. When the Aztecs reframed their violent rise as the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy, the god Huitzilopochtli guiding them to build Tenochtitlan where an eagle perched on a cactus, they turned conquest into destiny. Descent wasn't just rebellion, it was sacrilege, and that's the genius of mythic blueprints. They transform raw power into something sacred, unshakable. Yet this power cuts both ways. The same stories that unite can also erase. When the Spanish toppled the Aztec Empire, they didn't just destroy temples, they rewrote the myths, painting indigenous beliefs as pagan ignorance to justify their own divine mission. History, as they say, is written by the victors, but dig deeper and you'll find the fingerprints of the silenced, the counter-narratives buried under official dogma. Because wherever there's a myth enforcing power, there's someone resisting it, whispering a different version, keeping alive the stories empires tried to smother. So what does this mean for us today? Every time a leader invokes tradition or destiny, they're tapping into this ancient playbook. The battle over narratives isn't confined to dusty scrolls or crumbling ruins. It's happening now in the stories we're told about who we are and who gets to decide. Because when you control the myth, you control the people, and that's a truth as old as civilization itself. Consider the Enuma Elish, Mesopotamia's great creation epic, where the world is born from chaos and God's battle for supremacy. At first glance, it's a cosmic drama, but look closer and you'll see a political manifesto carved into clay. The earliest versions, sung in Sumerian city-states, celebrated Enlil, the storm god of Nippur, as the supreme ruler. But when Babylon rose to power, something remarkable happened. The story was rewritten and a new champion emerged, Marduk, Babylon's patron god. Suddenly, he wasn't just another deity. He was the savior of the universe, the one who defeated primordial chaos and reshaped the world. Coincidence? Hardly. This wasn't just poetic license. It was a calculated move by Babylonian rulers to cement their dominance. As Babylon's influence grew, so did Marduk's role in the myth. In earlier versions, other gods held center stage, but in the Babylonian Enuma Elish, Marduk's victory isn't just divine will, it's a blueprint for earthly power. The gods themselves declare him king, mirroring the way Babylon's rulers demanded loyalty from rival city-states. The message was unmistakable. Just as Marduk brought order from chaos, Babylon would bring unity to Mesopotamia. Resistance wasn't just feudal, it was against the very fabric of creation. What's fascinating is how openly political this rewriting was. The Enuma Elish wasn't hidden away in temples. It was performed publicly during the New Year festival, a spectacle of state power. Imagine the scene, priests chanting as actors reenacted Marduk's triumph, reinforcing the idea that Babylon's rule was as natural as the sunrise, and it worked. By aligning their city's fate with cosmic order, Babylonian kings didn't just claim authority, they made dissent feel like blasphemy. But here's the twist, this wasn't unique to Babylon. Across Mesopotamia, as city-states rose and fell, their gods rose and fell with them. When the Akkadian Empire under Sargon the Great conquered Sumer, his daughter, the high priestess Enheduanna, composed hymns merging Sumerian and Akkadian deities, softening cultural resistance. Later, Assyrian rulers tweaked the Enuma Elish to elevate their god Ashur over Marduk, proving myths were never set in stone. They were tools reshaped to fit new masters. So how deliberate were these changes? Extremely. These weren't minor edits but full-scale narrative takeovers. Each alteration served a purpose: to legitimize conquest, unify diverse peoples, or erase rival traditions. When Marduk's statue was kidnapped by enemy forces, it wasn't just a religious crisis, it was a propaganda disaster, a blow to the empire's cosmic legitimacy. Because in Mesopotamia, myths weren't just stories, they were the operating system of power, and updating them wasn't optional, it was survival. This raises a darker question: how many eternal truths in history were actually flexed to serve the powerful? From Babylon's Marduk to Rome's Aeneid, the pattern is clear. Myths don't just reflect power, they manufacture it. And once you see the strings, you realize the puppeteers have always been the ones holding the pen. The sands of Egypt whisper secrets of kings who weren't just rulers, they were living gods. Take Ramses II, whose name echoes through history as Ramses the Great. But behind the towering statues and temple walls lies a masterclass in myth-making. Ramses didn't just inherit his throne, he rewrote his lineage, etching himself into the divine family tree of Amun-Ra, the king of the gods. On temple walls, he's depicted suckled by goddesses, his birth foretold by cosmic omens. Reality, his father, Seti I, was a formidable pharaoh but mortal. The message was clear. Ramses wasn't just chosen by the gods, he was of them. This wasn't vanity, it was political genius. The Abidos king list, commissioned by Seti and Ramses, is a striking example. Carved in sacred stone, it meticulously names 76 pharaohs, but conspicuously skips entire dynasties. Rulers like Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh who dared to wear the beard of kingship, or Akhenaten, the heretic who abandoned the old gods, vanish from the record. These weren't oversights, they were deliberate erasures, a way to reshape history into a clean, divine narrative. Why? Because legitimacy in ancient Egypt wasn't just about power, it was about continuity. By curating the past, Ramses and his predecessors made their rule seem like an unbroken thread woven by the gods themselves. But here's the twist, everyone knew the truth. The workers who built Ramses' monuments, the scribes who penned his praises, they remembered the forgotten pharaohs. Yet the myth held sway because it served a deeper purpose. In a land where the Nile's floods were as unpredictable as invaders, the pharaoh's divinity wasn't just pageantry. It was social glue, a way to unite a civilization under the idea that chaos could be kept at bay, but only if the god-king's order prevailed. Greece faced similar challenges, but with a different playbook. Where Egypt wielded absolute divine right, Greek city-states like Athens leaned on shared myths. The Athenians didn't have a pharaoh, they had Theseus, the legendary king who slayed the Minotaur. But even here, the stories shifted to fit political needs. When democracy dawned, Theseus evolved from a warrior king into a proto-democrat, a founder who consulted the people. The lesson: whether carved in stone or sung in poetry, myths are never static. They bend to the will of those who hold the chisel or the pen. Greek city-states were a patchwork of rival powers, each fiercely independent, yet they shared something powerful: the stories of Homer and Hesiod. These weren't just poets, they were nation-builders wielding mythology as a unifying force. Picture the Iliad and Odyssey, recited at festivals across Greece, binding Sparta, Athens, and Corinth to a common past. Heroes like Achilles and Odysseus became cultural touchstones, their struggles framed as Panhellenic triumphs. But this wasn't organic. Rulers and priests actively shaped these epics, smoothing over regional differences to create a shared Greek identity. The message was clear: despite your squabble, you all descend from these legends. Delphi's oracle took this further, turning myth into political sacrament. When city-states clashed over territory, they didn't just send armies, they consulted the oracle, whose cryptic pronouncements often echoed the interests of powerful patrons. A Spartan king seeking legitimacy, the oracle might declare him a descendant of Heracles. An Athenian colony disputed by rivals, a prophecy could reveal the land was promised to them by Apollo. These weren't random divine whims. The priesthood at Delphi wielded myths like diplomatic tools, sanctifying conquests and treaties alike. The result: a fractured Greece began to see itself as a family, with gods as their shared ancestors. Athens and Sparta took this playbook in starkly different directions. Athens embraced Theseus, reframing him as a democratic unifier who liberated the oppressed. His myth evolved with the times, once a lone warrior, now a leader who consulted the people. Sparta, though, doubled down on Heracles, the ultimate strongman. His labors mirrored Spartan ideals: endurance, discipline, conquest. While Athenians painted Theseus as a founder of institutions, Spartans used Heracles to justify their militarized society. Same myths, opposite agendas. Rome watched and learned. When they absorbed Greece, they didn't discard its myths, they repurposed them. The Aeneid didn't just borrow from Homer, it supplanted him, grafting Rome onto Greek heroes while subtly asserting superiority. Aeneas, fleeing Troy, didn't just find a new home, he founded the lineage that would birth Rome. It was mythic diplomacy, a way to claim Greek glory while rising above it. Because empires don't just conquer land, they conquer stories, and the winners don't just rewrite history, they become it. Rome didn't just conquer the Mediterranean, it rewrote the very myths that birthed it. At the heart of this lies Virgil's Aeneid, a masterpiece that didn't just tell a story but engineered one. On the surface, it's an epic of Aeneas, a Trojan prince fleeing his burning city to found a new homeland. But beneath the poetry, it's a political blueprint meticulously crafted to serve Emperor Augustus. Here's the genius of it. By tying Rome's origins to Troy, Virgil didn't just give the empire a glamorous backstory, he gave it divine legitimacy. Aeneas wasn't merely a refugee, he was a hero guided by the gods, his journey preordained to culminate in Rome's rise, and who stood at the end of that prophetic lineage. Augustus himself, the restorer of Rome's golden age. Augustus didn't stumble into this narrative, he weaponized it. After decades of civil war, Rome was fractured, its people exhausted. So Augustus positioned himself not as a warlord, but as a savior returning Rome to its mythical roots of piety, order, and virtue. The Aeneid became his manifesto. Aeneas' struggles mirrored Rome's own, his duty to the gods paralleling Augustus' claim to revive traditional religion. Even the epic's famous shield scene, depicting Rome's future triumphs, culminates in Augustus' victory at Actium. Coincidence? Hardly. This was myth as political theater, with Augustus cast as the climax of a 1,000-year destiny. But the Aeneid was just one thread in a larger tapestry. Augustus filled Rome with symbols of this manufactured legacy. He restored ancient temples, revived forgotten rituals, and even claimed descent from Venus through Aeneas. The message was everywhere. His rule wasn't just power, it was fate, and it worked. By embedding himself in Rome's foundational myths, Augustus turned his fragile republic into an empire draped in the aura of eternity. Yet Rome's mythmaking didn't stop at its borders. As the empire expanded, so did its stories. Along the Silk Road, where cultures collided and traded, Rome's myths morphed to absorb and overshadow local traditions. In Anatolia, Roman emperors were depicted alongside local gods, their likenesses blending into hybrid deities. In Egypt, Augustus had himself portrayed as pharaoh, hijacking the iconography of divine kingship. This wasn't just conquest, it was narrative colonization. By grafting Roman myths onto older traditions, the empire didn't just rule lands, it rewrote identities. The Silk Road became a highway of mythic exchange, but with a twist. Rome's stories often traveled with a stamp of supremacy. When Roman coins reached India, they carried the image of Augustus, subtly asserting his godlike status even in foreign markets. Meanwhile, in Palmyra, local elites adopted Roman myths to climb the imperial ladder, their temples fusing Roman and Syrian gods. This wasn't organic cultural blending, it was strategic assimilation, a way to survive in a world where myths were currency. So what's the takeaway? Rome's genius wasn't just in building roads or armies, but in building stories so compelling they could bend the past to justify the present. From Virgil's quill to Silk Road caravans, myths were the invisible threads stitching empire together. And that's the unsettling truth. When you control the narrative, you don't just rule territory. You shape reality itself. Along the Silk Road, where caravans carried silk and spices, something far more potent traveled with them. Myths, not just stories, but bridges between worlds. The Kushan Empire, straddling the crossroads of India, China, and Rome, mastered this art of mythic diplomacy. Their coins tell a silent revolution. Greek gods like Heracles stand shoulder to shoulder with Buddha, while Zoroastrian fire altars flicker beside Hindu deities. This wasn't cultural chaos, it was a deliberate strategy. By merging pantheons, the Kushans didn't just honor local traditions. They made their rule feel inevitable, a natural extension of every conquered people's beliefs. Take the Buddha's transformation. In Gandhara, under Kushan patronage, artists sculpted him with the idealized features of Apollo wavy hair, draped robes, even a halo borrowed from Roman sun gods. This Greco-Buddhist fusion wasn't accidental. For Greek-speaking merchants and Persian nobles alike, seeing the divine in familiar terms eased acceptance. The message was subtle but potent. Your gods and ours, they've been speaking the same language all along. China's Han Dynasty played a similar game. When their envoys reached Central Asia, they didn't impose Confucian doctrine. They wrapped their ambitions in local myth. The Queen Mother of the West, a Taoist deity, suddenly appeared in Cotton's legends as a protector of Silk Road oases. Meanwhile, Han emperors adopted the Son of Heaven title, a cosmic claim that resonated with Turkic sky worship. Myths became the ultimate bargaining chip, smoothing trade deals and military alliances alike. This syncretism had teeth. When the Kushans conquered Mathura, they didn't erase its Hindu gods. They adopted them, minting coins with Shiva's bull alongside their own king's face. Resistance crumbled not under swords, but under the weight of shared symbolism. Even Rome, watching from afar, got the memo. Traders returning from the east brought back tales of the wise lord Mithras, an echo of Persian Mithra, repackaged for Roman legionaries. The Silk Road didn't just move goods, it laundered myths, stripping them of foreignness until they felt like home. Yet this fluidity had limits. As monotheism rose, Zoroastrianism's dualism, Judaism's covenant, Christianity's singular god myths hardened into dogma. No more blending, no more compromise. The old games of diplomatic syncretism faltered when empires insisted their truth was the only truth. And that shift would reshape the world far more than any caravan ever could. Monotheism didn't just change religions, it rewrote the rules of myth itself. Where polytheistic empires had blended gods like ingredients in a cosmic stew, monotheism demanded a stark choice, one truth or heresy. Take Constantinople under Emperor Constantine. Overnight, the city's skyline transformed. Christian crosses rose where temples to Apollo and Zeus once stood. But this wasn't just architectural rebranding. It was a systematic dismantling of rival creation stories. Pagan rituals were banned, oracles silenced, and the great library of Antioch burned, its scrolls of ancient myths turning to ash. The message was clear: there was no room for competing narratives in God's empire. Yet in Persia, a different experiment unfolded. The Sassanid Empire embraced Zoroastrianism's dualistic vision, a cosmic battle between light and darkness, but with surprising flexibility. Fire temples stood alongside Jewish synagogues, and Manichaean preachers blended Christian and Persian myths into new revelations. Unlike Byzantium's iron grip on doctrine, Persia's rulers understood something crucial: absolute unity wasn't always the best strategy. By allowing controlled diversity, they kept restless provinces loyal while still centering their own state religion. But could rival myths ever truly vanish? Look to the edges of these empires and you'll find stubborn survivals. In Byzantine Anatolia, villagers still whispered of Cybele, the mother goddess, disguising her rituals as Christian feast days. Armenian scribes secretly preserved fragments of pre-Zoroastrian legends in the margins of biblical texts. Even Charlemagne's brutal Saxon conversions couldn't stamp out echoes of Thor's hammer in folk charms. The lesson: myths don't die, they hide, mutate, and resurface in unexpected ways. Medieval Europe became the stage for this paradox. As monks meticulously copied Virgil's pagan epics, they couldn't resist adding Christian glosses, turning Aeneid's journey into an allegory of the soul's path to salvation. The Norse sagas, once sung in mead halls, were quietly rewritten with saints replacing gods. This wasn't destruction, it was alchemy, transforming old myths into vessels for new power. Because the deepest truth about stories, they're immortal. You can ban them, burn them, or baptize them, but like seeds in winter, they wait for the right moment to bloom again. Charlemagne didn't just wear a crown, he forged an entire mythic identity, stitching together Roman grandeur and Christian destiny with ruthless precision. On Christmas Day in the year 800, as the Frankish king knelt in Rome's St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Leo III placed an imperial diadem on his head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. The symbolism was explosive. Here was a Germanic warlord crowned in the heart of Christendom, resurrecting a title dead for over 3 centuries. But this wasn't mere flattery. It was a calculated rebirth of Rome's mythic legacy, now baptized in Christian scripture. Charlemagne's chroniclers went to work, painting him as a new Constantine, chosen by God to unite church and empire. His court at Aachen became a stage for this hybrid mythology. Roman arches framed Christian altars, while scholars scoured ancient texts to prove his bloodline stretched back to Troy's survivors. The message was unmistakable. The barbarian North hadn't conquered Rome, it had fulfilled it. Then came the ultimate prop, the donation of Constantine, a document claiming the first Christian emperor had granted the Pope temporal power over Rome and the West. Charlemagne's allies brandished it like a divine deed to property, never mind that scholars would later prove it an 8th century forgery. At the time, it served its purpose perfectly, framing papal authority as inherited from Rome's golden age. This wasn't just political theater. It was mythic alchemy, turning the church into Rome's legal heir and Charlemagne into its sword-bearing protector. Overnight, the messy reality of barbarian kingdoms dissolved into a grand narrative of Christian empire rising from pagan ashes. But the myth-making didn't stop there. Medieval chroniclers faced an awkward truth. Many noble European families descended from the very tribes that had sacked Rome, so they got creative. The Lombards, once painted as savage invaders, became God's instruments punishing Roman corruption. The Franks' violent origins were sanitized into tales of Trojan exiles wandering Europe like biblical patriarchs. Even Viking raiders, centuries later, would be reinvented as descendants of exiled Roman generals. The past became clay, reshaped to fit the present's needs. Yet beneath this Christianized facade, pagan roots refused to die. When Renaissance scholars cracked open long-lost Roman texts, they found something startling: a world where gods, not saints, shaped destiny. Petrarch wept over Virgil's poetry, not for its piety but its raw humanity. Artists like Botticelli painted Venus rising from the waves, her pagan beauty undimmed by centuries of censure. The church recoiled, but the genie was out of the bottle. The rediscovery of these lost myths didn't just challenge Christian dogma. It revealed how thin the veneer of religious orthodoxy really was. and how eagerly the old stories rushed back when given air to breathe. This tension between imposed myths and suppressed truths would explode in the Reformation as Protestants weaponized the donation's exposure to undermine papal authority. But that's another story. For now, remember this: when Charlemagne clasped that crown, he wasn't just reviving an empire. He was proving how fragile history becomes in the hands of those who dare to rewrite it. In Florence's sun-drenched piazzas, a quiet revolution was unfolding, not with swords, but with paintbrushes and parchment. The Medici, that cunning dynasty of bankers and power brokers, didn't just collect ancient statues, they weaponized them. Take Botticelli's Birth of Venus. On the surface, a stunning homage to the goddess emerging from sea foam, but look closer. Here was pagan myth, dripping with sensuality, commissioned for a Medici villa, a deliberate thumb in the eye of church dogma. This wasn't just art, it was a coded manifesto proclaiming that beauty and truth existed beyond the Vatican's narrow walls. The Medici's genius lay in their patronage of Neoplatonism, a philosophy that recast myths as allegories of divine wisdom. Marsilio Ficino, their house philosopher, argued that Plato's ideas and pagan myths weren't heresy, they were pre-Christian revelations, fragments of eternal truth waiting to be decoded. Suddenly, Apollo wasn't just a sun god, he symbolized Christ's light. The labors of Hercules became metaphors for the soul's struggle toward virtue. By draping Greco-Roman myths in philosophical respectability, the Medici gave intellectuals cover to explore ideas that would have been dangerous if stated plainly. But why take such risks? Because myths, in the right hands, were the ultimate subversive tools. When Lorenzo de' Medici staged pageants with actors playing Olympian gods, he wasn't just entertaining crowds. He was reminding them of a world where authority wasn't monopolized by priests. Even the Vatican couldn't resist the allure. Pope Alexander VI, no stranger to power plays, had Pinturicchio paint his private apartments with scenes of Isis, Osiris, and Apollo, subtly equating his papacy with ancient divine rulers. The irony was delicious. The Church, which had spent centuries demonizing pagan myths, now used them to glorify itself. Yet this revival had a darker echo. As European ships reached new continents, explorers carried these repurposed myths like intellectual cargo. The Aztecs' Quetzalcoatl, once a feathered serpent god, was reinvented by Spanish friars as a pre-Christian apostle, a convenient bridge to conversion. In Goa, Portuguese colonizers grafted local deities onto Catholic saints, creating hybrid idols that made conquest taste like continuity. The Renaissance's mythic flexibility, born in Florentine salons, had become a global strategy, one where stories weren't just told, but unmade and remade to serve new masters. So were these myths art or propaganda? The answer is both. They were palettes for beauty and blueprints for power, often in the same stroke. Because when you control how people imagine the past, you hold the keys to their future. And no one knew that better than the empires rising on the horizon. When European ships first scraped against Australia's shores, they didn't just bring cannons and disease, they brought a myth so potent it could erase an entire people. Terra nullius, Latin for nobody's land, became the legal fiction that justified colonization. Never mind that Aboriginal nations had thrived there for over 65,000 years, their Dreamtime stories mapping every mountain and river. To the British, these weren't signs of civilization, but obstacles to conquest, so they wielded myth like a scalpel, slicing away millennia of history to declare the continent empty, a blank page awaiting their divine script. The cruelty of Terra nullius lay in its audacity. Unlike earlier empires that at least acknowledged indigenous peoples, even if to subjugate them, this myth denied their very existence. When Captain James Cook planted the British flag in 1770, He didn't see complex societies with intricate kinship networks and oral histories stretching back to the Ice Age. He saw absence, and that absence became the foundation for theft on an unimaginable scale. The land wasn't stolen, it was discovered, its original inhabitants recast as part of the flora and fauna. But contrast this with the stories they overwrote. Aboriginal Dreamtime isn't just folklore, it's a living atlas where every rock and creek pulses with ancestral memory. The rainbow serpent didn't just create rivers, it is the rivers, its body woven into the landscape. The Woggle's breath is the Swan River's currents. These aren't metaphors, they're title deeds written in song and ceremony, proof of a bond between people and place that no parchment could replicate. To call this land empty wasn't just wrong, it was a violence against reality itself. Yet the myth persisted because it served a brutal purpose. By erasing indigenous title, colonists could parcel out the land as crown property, auctioning it to settlers who saw themselves as pioneers, not invaders. Schools taught generations of Australians that their history began with Cook's arrival, reducing 65 millennia to a footnote. Even the law conspired. Courts upheld terra nullius until 1992, when the landmark Mabo decision finally shattered it. That's how long a lie can linger when dressed as tradition. But here's where the story twists. Just as empires weaponized myths, the oppressed learned to wield them right back. In the 1960s, Aboriginal activists began reclaiming Dreamtime narratives not as quaint legends, but as legal evidence. The Yolngu people's Gove land rights case hinged on sacred songs proving their connection to territory, a direct challenge to terra nullius. Though they lost in court, the seed was planted. Myths could be armor, not just shackles. Today, when Aboriginal elders perform welcome to country ceremonies at official events, they're not just offering greetings. They're asserting an unbroken lineage that predates empires, a reminder that the land was never empty, it was waiting. From Uluru's base to Sydney's skyscrapers, Dreamtime stories are resurfacing, not in history books, but on street murals, in courtroom testimonies, even in video games like Terra Nullius, where players experience colonization from the other side. The myth's victims have become its most devastating critics, turning the tools of dispossession into instruments of revival. This isn't just about Australia. From the Americas' doctrine of discovery to Africa's empty savanna justifications, terra nullius had cousins everywhere, but so did the resistance. The Maoris' Wakapapa genealogies, the Lakota's Black Hills origin stories, all were dismissed as superstition until they became the foundation for land claims. Because when your very existence is a counter-narrative to empire, survival isn't just physical, it's mythic, and that's a battle no conquest can fully erase. When the British Empire declared New Zealand theirs in 1840, they didn't just claim land, they tried to overwrite an entire cosmology. To the Maori, the islands weren't empty territory but the body of the god Maui who fished them from the sea. Their Wakapapa genealogies didn't just trace ancestry, they wove people, land, and gods into a single unbroken thread. Colonial officials dismissed these stories as primitive fables until the Maori turned them into legal weapons. In the 1970s, activists like Eva Rickard began citing Wakapapa in court, proving their ties to confiscated lands. Suddenly, myths weren't just folklore, they were title deeds older than the crown itself. The Navajo Nation waged a similar battle through their Diné Bahane, the epic of their emergence into this world. When uranium mining corporations poisoned their water in the 20th century, elders didn't just protest pollution, they invoked the sacred covenant between the holy people and the land. You don't sever a covenant, they argued, any more than you sever your own breath. It sounded mystical to bureaucrats, but this was more than poetry. By framing environmental destruction as a spiritual violation, They forced courts to confront colonialism's deepest wound, the severing of people from their stories. What's striking is how these counter-myths operate today. In British Columbia, the Gitxsan people won a landmark case in 1997 by presenting a dog, oral histories of their clans as evidence of continuous occupation. Judges initially scoffed, demanding written records, but when elders sang the Adok in court, mapping rivers and mountains through generations of song, the truth became undeniable. Some deeds are carved in memory, not parchment. Meanwhile, in Norway, the Sami are reviving yoik chants, once banned as devil's music, to reclaim ancestral lands from wind farms. These aren't nostalgia acts. They're acts of narrative resistance, proving that when empires erase myths, they don't disappear. They go underground, waiting to resurface. Yet the most potent rebellion might be in the retelling itself. When Maori parents teach children that the god Tain didn't just create forests but is the forest, they're not passing down a bedtime story. They're immunizing them against the myth of human dominion over nature. Navajo sheepherders who recite how changing woman gave them livestock aren't just preserving tradition. They're upholding an alternative to capitalism's extraction logic. These stories don't just resist empire, they offer blueprints for survival in its wreckage. Healing through myth isn't metaphorical. In Australia, Aboriginal communities use dreamtime narratives to treat intergenerational trauma, grounding youth in identities colonialism tried to shatter. The Maori Mari ceremonial spaces where myths are performed have become hubs for addiction recovery, proving that stories can stitch together what policies tore apart. Even Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission recognized this, recommending Indigenous language and myth revival as reparations. Because when you've been told your gods are dead and your stories lies, reclaiming them isn't just cultural, it's medicinal. Now consider modern nation-states where myths still pulse beneath the surface of passports and anthems. America's City Upon a Hill, France's universal civilizing mission, even Russia's obsession with Kievan Rus, all are secularized creation stories repackaged for the age of borders. The difference: indigenous counter-myths acknowledge their own making, wearing their seams proudly. They don't claim to be inevitable, just alive. And in a world where the loudest stories still dictate who matters, that's the most radical truth of all. The 19th century wasn't just an age of steam engines and revolutions. It was a factory of myths, churning out stories to stitch fractured lands into nations. Take Germany, a patchwork of duchies and kingdoms with no shared state but a sudden hunger for unity. Enter the Nibelungenlied, a medieval epic dredged from obscurity and polished into a national saga. On the surface, it's a tale of dragonslayer Siegfried and betrayal, but in the hands of romantic scholars, it became something more, proof of a primordial German spirit, untouched by Roman or French influence. Philosophers like Johann Gottfried Herder preached that true nationhood lived in the Volksgeist, the soul of the people, preserved in folklore. Suddenly, collecting fairy tales wasn't just academic, it was political. The Brothers Grimm didn't merely transcribe stories, they curated a cultural DNA, scrubbing away French loanwords to imagine a linguistically pure past that never really existed. Yet this myth-making had a shadow. By the time Wagner's Ring Cycle turned the Nibelungenlied into operatic spectacle, the epic's heroes had morphed into symbols of Germanic destiny, a destiny soon twisted to justify expansion and exclusion. The irony: the original medieval poem was deeply cosmopolitan, woven with influences from Burgundy to Byzantium. But nationalist myth thrives on erasure, smoothing messy history into a single, unbroken lineage. Compare this to the Ottoman Empire's millet system, where pluralism wasn't just tolerated, it was institutionalized. Unlike Europe's obsession with ethnic purity, The Ottomans ruled through a mosaic of semi-autonomous religious communities, each governed by its own myths. Greek Orthodox bishops, Armenian merchants, Jewish rabbis, all could appeal to their own sacred narratives under the Sultan's umbrella. The empire's legitimacy didn't come from a single bloodline, but from its role as protector of diverse truths. When Sultan Mehmed II conquered Constantinople in 1453, he didn't demolish the Orthodox Church. He appointed a patriarch, framing himself as heir to both Caesar and Caliph. This wasn't weakness, it was strategic myth-making, leveraging pluralism to hold an empire together. So why did Europe's nations cling to singular origins while empires like the Ottomans thrived on multiplicity? The answer lies in the stakes of belonging. Nations needed myths of sameness to justify borders, while empires peddled myths of difference to manage them. A German peasant in Bavaria and a burgher in Prussia might share nothing until they were told they were branches of the same ancient oak. Conversely, an Ottoman Christian and Muslim didn't need to worship the same gods. They just had to accept the Sultan as the thread tying their stories together. But here's the uncomfortable question. Are modern nations just empires with better PR? France didn't annex Brittany and Occitania, it assimilated them, replacing regional tongues with Parisian French and local saints with Marion, the Republican goddess. The United States' manifest destiny wasn't so different from Rome's Aeneid, painting westward expansion as divine will. Even democracy has its creation myths, from the Athenian Golden Age to the Magna Carta, often glossing over who was excluded from the story. And then came the 20th century's darkest twist, fascism's obsession with myth. Mussolini didn't just admire Roman emperors, he became one, staging rallies in faux forums and calling his regime the Third Rome. Hitler's Nazis didn't invent Aryan supremacy, they weaponized 19th century folklore, turning the Nibelungenlied into a blueprint for racial purity. The Nuremberg rallies weren't just speeches, they were rituals designed to feel ancient, inevitable. Because when myth isn't just history but destiny, dissent becomes heresy. Yet the most chilling lesson isn't how fascists used myths, it's how easily those myths outlived them. Wagner's operas still play in Bayreuth, Siegfried's sword still gleams in museum cases, and the Volksgeist still whispers in far-right manifestos. Because nations like empires are stories, and stories don't end when the book closes. They wait patiently for the next reader to flip the page. Fascism didn't just borrow from ancient myths, it became one. A dark fairy tale where bloodlines dictated destiny and violence was sacred theater. Hitler's obsession with Norse sagas wasn't academic. It was alchemical, transforming Viking lore into Nazi ideology. The SS adopted runes as insignia, not because they understood their historical context, but because they craved the aura of primal power. The Eddas, with their tales of Valhalla and Ragnarök, were stripped of nuance and weaponized. Suddenly, the Aesir gods weren't flawed beings wrestling with fate. They were prototypes for the Aryan Superman, their struggles reframed as racial prophecy. Heinrich Himmler even sent archaeologists scouring Europe for Thor's hammer, not to study it, but to wield it as proof of Germanic supremacy. The irony. The actual Norse sagas celebrated diversity, trading with Arabs, hiring Slavic mercenaries, worshipping a one-eyed god who prized wisdom over purity. But fascism doesn't do nuance. It takes fragments of the past and forges them into swords. Mussolini played the same game with Roman iconography, but with a Mediterranean twist. Where Hitler dreamed of Valhalla, the Deuce staged photo ops in togas, his speeches dripping with references to Augustus and Caesar. He drained marshes not for agriculture, but to reclaim the Roman spirit, and built highways as modern Appian ways. The fascist calendar even rebooted time itself, counting years from the 1922 March on Rome as if it were a new founding of the city. This wasn't just vanity, it was liturgy, a performance meant to convince Italians that fascism wasn't a political experiment, but the inevitable return of imperial glory. The darker truth, ancient Rome was a multicultural empire where Syrians became emperors and Egyptian gods were worshipped in London. Mussolini's Rome was a cardboard replica painted in blood. The danger of these literalized myths wasn't just their inaccuracy, it was their totalizing grip on reality. When Hitler spoke of Lebensraum, he didn't cite economic policy. He invoked Völkisch legends of German tribes driven eastward by destiny. Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia was framed as a reenactment of Scipio Africanus' conquests. History wasn't a guide, it was a script, and dissenters weren't just wrong, they were heretics standing in the way of rebirth. This is why fascist regimes burned books and rewrote textbooks, not to hide the past, but to replace it with a myth so potent it overrode lived experience. Yet the Cold War proved myths could be repurposed without swords or swastikas. America's frontier spirit became a cosmic battle against communism with John F. Kennedy declaring the new frontier as if manifest destiny had simply swapped wagons for satellites. Soviet cosmonauts weren't just pilots, they were new socialist men, their space flights proof that Marxist science could outpace capitalist decadence. Even the Berlin Wall was mythologized not as a prison but as an anti-fascist rampart. The battleground had shifted from bloodlines to ideologies, but the stakes were the same: control the story, and you control the future. The lesson here isn't that myths are inherently dangerous, it's that they're powerful. Whether carved on runestones or broadcast in propaganda reels, they shape what we believe is possible. And when empires or dictators monopolize that power, reality itself becomes their plaything. The Cold War's space race wasn't just about rockets and satellites. It was a battle of mythic proportions, where science and symbolism collided to rewrite humanity's destiny. When Sputnik beeped its way across the night sky in 1957, it didn't just mark a technological triumph for the Soviets, it shattered America's sense of cosmic exceptionalism. Overnight, the heavens became a new frontier, not of gods and heroes, but of ideologies and superpowers. Kennedy's response, the Apollo program, framed not as a mere engineering feat but as a modern-day odyssey. "We choose to go to the moon," he declared, echoing the call of ancient explorers, "not because it is easy, but because it is hard." This wasn't just rhetoric, it was myth-making in real time, casting astronauts as Argonauts and Cape Canaveral as a launchpad for national rebirth. The Soviets played the same game with even grander strokes. Yuri Gagarin's 108-minute orbit wasn't just a flight, it was a secular ascension, proof that the new socialist man could conquer the cosmos. Soviet posters depicted cosmonauts as saintly figures, bathed in celestial light, their helmets haloed like icons. Meanwhile, America's Mercury 7 were molded into cowboy knight hybrids: John Glenn, the clean-cut patriot, Alan Shepard, the daring test pilot. Their missions weren't just scientific, they were sacred, broadcast like high-tech epics to a global audience. Even the spacecraft names carried mythic weight: Vostok, East for the Soviets, evoking dawn and rebirth; Apollo for the Americans, linking spaceflight to the god of light and reason. But beneath the spectacle lurked a deeper question: can science replace myth? On one level, the space race seemed to herald a post-mythic age, one where equations, not oracles, dictated humanity's path. Yet the narratives told by both superpowers were steeped in the same archetypes that once filled temple walls. The moon landing wasn't just a giant leap for mankind. It was a ritual of transcendence, complete with flag planting and communion-like meals in zero gravity. The USSR's lunar probes, scattering hammer and sickle pennants on the lunar surface, mirrored ancient offerings to the gods. Science had become the myth, its language draped in the old symbols of destiny and divine favor. Now fast forward to today's corporate space race. Elon Musk doesn't sell rockets, he sells Mars colonization, a modern exodus for backing up humanity's consciousness. Jeff Bezos dreams of O'Neill cylinders, orbital cities straight from 70s sci-fi. The myths haven't vanished, they've just swapped national flags for corporate logos. When SpaceX's Falcon Heavy launched a Tesla Roadster toward Mars, it wasn't just a publicity stunt, it was a ritual, a silicon and steel votive tossed into the void. The message, the cosmos is no longer the domain of nations, but of disruptors, and their creation stories are being written in real time. So here's the irony: the more rational our age becomes, the more we cling to mythic frameworks to make sense of our ambitions. From Sputnik's beep to Starship's roar, the stories we tell about space aren't just about discovery. They're about who we believe we're meant to be. And in that grand tradition, the next chapter won't be written by priests or poets, but by engineers and the empires that fund them. Steve Jobs didn't just build computers in that Los Altos garage. He built a modern creation myth, one that would outshine even the grandest royal genealogies. Think about it, a lone genius tinkering with circuit boards, defying corporate giants to birth the personal computing revolution. It's a story so potent it overshadows Apple's messier truths, like the fact that Jobs' actual technical contributions were minimal, or that the garage was barely used. But accuracy isn't the point. Like Augustus linking himself to Venus, Jobs' garage became a sacred site, a Silicon Valley Bethlehem where pilgrims could touch the origins of their iPhones. And Apple isn't alone. Jeff Bezos' desk made from a door frames Amazon's rise as a scrappy underdog tale, obscuring its ruthless monopolism. These aren't just PR stunts, they're corporate theogonies, origin stories designed to make billionaires seem like destinies chosen. Compare this to medieval monarchs tracing their bloodlines to Trojan heroes or gods. The Tudor dynasty didn't just claim the English throne, they commissioned historians to prove their descent from King Arthur, turning political ambition into cosmic inevitability. Tech giants do the same, but with hoodies instead of crowns. Google's "Don't be evil" mantra wasn't just a slogan, it was a secular commandment, positioning the company as the righteous knight in a digital dark age. The parallels are uncanny. Just as kings use divine right to justify conquest, CEOs use disruption to legitimize monopolies. The difference: where royals had court poets, corporations have TED Talks. Yet these myths aren't free. Every time we buy into the genius founder narrative, we surrender power. Tesla's cult of Musk depends on us ignoring his factory's labor violations, just as Louis XIV's Versailles spectacles distracted from peasant famines. And like all myths, they're flexible. When Amazon faced antitrust scrutiny, Bezos suddenly emphasized his immigrant father's humble sacrifices, a rebrand from predator to proletarian. It's mythic alchemy, turning exploitation into inspiration with a well-placed anecdote. Enter the postmodern twist. Today's consumers aren't passive believers. We know these stories are crafted, yet we play along, treating Apple keynotes like religious revivals and Musk's tweets like oracle pronouncements. This isn't ignorance, it's complicity. We've entered an era of ironic mythmaking where the illusion is the product. The garage, the door desk, the started in a dorm room trope. They're not meant to deceive, but to invite participation in a shared fiction. Like Renaissance nobles commissioning portraits as Roman senators, we're all colluding in the theater. But here's the catch: when corporations monopolize myth, they don't just sell products, they sell meaning. Apple's Think Different campaign didn't hawk computers. It sold rebellion, wrapping consumerism in countercultural drag. Amazon's Day One mantra transforms worker burnout into a crusade. These aren't companies, they're storytelling empires, and every purchase is a votive offering to their pantheon. The question isn't whether these myths are true, but what happens when the only stories left are the ones that come with a subscription fee. Roland Barthes didn't just study myths, he cracked them open like eggs, revealing the slippery ideologies inside. In his groundbreaking work Mythologies, he argued that myths aren't timeless truths, but second-order sign systems, cultural codes dressed up as natural law. Take a simple bottle of French wine. To Barthes, it wasn't just fermented grapes, but a symbol of national identity, conviviality, even moral superiority. The myth wasn't in the liquid, it was in the story society poured around it. This was more than literary theory, it was a demolition charge under centuries of imperial storytelling. Because once you see myths as constructed, you realize they can be deconstructed. Enter postmodernism, the ultimate mythbuster. Where empires once etched their stories in stone, artists like Warhol and writers like Borges turned them into Hall of Mirrors games. Marvel's Thor comics took this to cosmic heights, transforming Norse gods into intergalactic superheroes who quip about Starbucks and ride the subway. Asgard isn't a sacred realm, it's a neon-lit floating city where Odin's spear might as well be a corporate scepter. This isn't just parody, it's mythic karaoke, where ancient narratives get remixed with postmodern irony. The message: these stories were always fluid, we're just finally admitting it. But here's the paradox: even as we mock grand narratives, we keep inventing new ones. Conspiracy theories like QAnon didn't emerge from a vacuum. Their medieval morality plays dressed in digital camouflage, complete with shadowy villains and prophesied redemptions. TikTok trends repackage heroes' journeys into 15-second arcs, while crypto evangelists preach blockchain like it's the next divine revelation. We haven't left the age of myths. We've entered the age of meta-myths, where we build stories about building stories. The digital realm accelerates this. Reddit threads dissect Marvel plot holes with the rigor of theologians debating scripture. Game of Thrones fan theories spiral into alternative canons, blurring the line between consumer and creator. Even memes function as micro-myths, distilled narratives that mutate faster than Zeus could shapeshift. The irony: our tools for deconstructing myths have become myth-making machines. TikTok's algorithm doesn't just recommend videos, it curates realities, stitching together personalized epics from viral fragments. So are we post-mythic? Hardly, we're just mythic in HD, hyper-aware of the strings, yet still eager to dance. Because whether it's a Viking saga or a viral tweet, humans don't outgrow myths. We just update the software, and as AI begins generating its own stories, we might soon find ourselves not just telling tales but being told by them. The algorithm isn't just code, it's the new oracle whispering personalized prophecies into our feeds. Platforms like TikTok and Meta don't just host content, they curate realities, spinning communal myths where virality replaces divine favor. Think about it: when a TikTok trend explodes overnight, it's not organic. It's algorithmic destiny, a digital Enuma Elish where the platform's logic decides which stories ascend to the heavens of the For You page. These aren't neutral tools, they're mythmakers shaping collective consciousness with every scroll. The algorithm has become a secular deity, its workings opaque yet omnipotent, demanding rituals like engagement and consistency to earn its blessings. Sound familiar? It's the same old power play, just draped in Silicon Valley jargon instead of temple incense. But not all digital myths bow to corporate overlords. Enter the open source movement, where creation stories are written in communal wikis and decentralized protocols. Linux isn't just an operating system, it's a counter-myth, proof that innovation can thrive without a central priesthood. On platforms like GitHub, every contributor becomes a co-author, their commits stitching together a living epic of collaboration. The difference is stark. Where Meta's algorithms hoard data like sacred relics, open-source projects treat code as common scripture, free to reinterpret, remix, and redistribute. It's the Volksgeist of the digital age, but with one crucial twist: no single empire controls the narrative. Yet even here, myths collide. Crypto-evangelists preach blockchain as the ultimate democratizing force, a ledger of cosmic fairness. But dig deeper, and you'll find familiar hierarchies, whales manipulating markets, DAOs replicating corporate structures. The promise of decentralization often clashes with the human craving for heroes and villains. Vitalik Buterin isn't just Ethereum's founder, he's its accidental prophet, his white papers treated as revelation. The internet's myths, it seems, can't escape the gravitational pull of storytelling itself. Now pivot to the environmental myths woven into this digital tapestry. Silicon Valley sells green tech as a planetary salvation myth, solar panels as modern-day talismans, carbon offsets as indulgences for the climate-conscious capitalist. But contrast this with indigenous movements like Land Back, which frame environmental justice not as innovation but as restitution, a return to pre-colonial relationships with the earth. The battle isn't just over policies, it's over which story wins. Do we believe in a future of techno-utopian geoengineering, or one where ancient myths of reciprocity with nature finally get the last word? The internet's greatest irony: it promised to democratize storytelling, yet its most powerful myths are still controlled by those who own the servers. But as glitches, from hashtag activism to viral worker strikes prove, no algorithm can fully predict what stories we'll choose to tell next. And that's where the real power lies, not in the myths themselves, but in who gets to rewrite them when the system isn't looking. Climate change isn't just reshaping coastlines, it's rewriting our myths. The Gaia hypothesis, first proposed by scientist James Lovelock, didn't just challenge environmental models, it offered a radical new creation story. Imagine Earth not as a rock we inhabit, but as a living organism breathing through forests, circulating nutrients like blood, regulating its own temperature. This wasn't just poetry, it was science draped in mythic language, framing the planet as a self-sustaining entity where humans are mere participants, not masters. Suddenly, pollution wasn't just harmful, it was sacrilege, a violation of cosmic balance. Environmentalists seized this narrative, turning data points into parables. Melting glaciers became Gaia's fever, deforestation her wounds. The power of this myth lies in its inversion of the old hierarchies, no longer man atop nature, but embedded within it, answerable to a system far older than empires. Yet Gaia isn't the first to propose such a vision. Indigenous cultures have long spoken of Earth as kin, not commodity. The Kogi of Colombia described the planet as a luna, a conscious being whose rivers are veins and mountains bones. Maori Wakapapa genealogies don't just link humans to ancestors, but to rivers, storms, and soil. These aren't quaint metaphors, they're legal frameworks. When New Zealand granted the Wanganui River personhood in 2017, it wasn't activism, it was the reactivation of an ancient myth, one that recognized water as an ancestor with rights. Compare this to Lovelock's Gaia, and the parallels are startling. Both collapse the divide between subject and environment, both demand accountability. The difference, one emerged from labs and journals, the other from oral traditions spanning millennia. Myths like these aren't passive, they are blueprints for survival. The Standing Rock protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline didn't just cite treaty violations, they invoked the Lakota prophecy of the Black Snake, a serpent whose oil-black coils would poison the land. By framing pipelines as mythic villains, activists transformed a legal battle into an existential struggle, galvanizing global support. Similarly, when Greta Thunberg declared, "Our house is on fire," she wasn't just sounding an alarm, she was invoking a narrative older than Grimm's fairy tales, the child who names the danger adults refuse to see. These stories don't just describe crises, they mobilize, turning abstract threats into moral imperatives. Now peer into the speculative futures brewing in this cauldron of old and new myths. Sci-fi authors like Kim Stanley Robinson imagine geoengineering as a modern creation chant where humanity engineers clouds to cool the planet, a Promethean twist on Maori sky father Ranganui's embrace of Earth Mother Papatuanuku. Meanwhile, a deep adaptation movements borrow from apocalyptic lore, preparing for collapse not with despair, but with the grim resolve of Ragnarok's survivors. Even corporate PR has mythic echoes. Carbon offset programs market themselves like digital indulgences, promising absolution for eco-sins. The question isn't whether we'll craft new myths to navigate climate chaos, but which myths will win and who gets to write them. Perhaps the answer lies in the stories we've forgotten. When the Haida of the Pacific Northwest say, "The world is as sharp as a knife," they warn that balance is precarious, that abundance demands reciprocity. Contrast that with Silicon Valley's myth of infinite growth on a finite planet, and the choice becomes stark: cling to the fables of extraction, or revive the ones that remember how to listen to the wind. Because the next creation story won't be etched in stone or code, it'll be written in the language of survival, by those who understood all along that myths aren't about the past. They're about who we're willing to become. Frank Herbert's Dune didn't just imagine a desert planet, it forged a modern mythology complete with its own holy war. The Butlerian Jihad, a crusade against thinking machines, functions like a lost biblical chapter, warning of humanity's fall should we surrender our will to technology. But this isn't ancient scripture, it's 20th century sci-fi, repackaging age-old fears of hubris into a galactic parable. Herbert understood something profound. As traditional religions wane, speculative fiction steps into the void, offering new cosmologies to navigate an uncertain world. The Jihad's taboo against AI mirrors the primal dread of Prometheus fire, knowledge that empowers but also corrupts. And just as medieval peasants saw divine judgment in plagues, Dune's Fremen view sandworms as both destroyers and messiahs, blending terror and reverence into a single mythic force. Star Wars takes this further, transforming Joseph Campbell's hero's journey into a pop religion. The Force isn't just energy, it's a postmodern pantheon, equal parts Taoist balance and samurai code. Jedi temples replace cathedrals, lightsaber duels become sacramental trials, and even the chant, "May the Force be with you," echoes liturgical benedictions. George Lucas didn't hide his influences, he remixed them, proving myths don't need antiquity to feel sacred. When fans debate midi-chlorians or Sith philosophy, they're not dissecting fiction, they're engaging in theology, passing dogma for life lessons. The genius of Star Wars lies in its ambiguity. The Force can be read as spiritual energy, quantum field, or sheer metaphor, allowing each viewer to imprint their own meaning. This myth-making isn't passive. Sci-fi franchises now spawn real-world rituals, Comic-Con pilgrimages, Dune's "Fear is the mind killer," mantras recited like psalms, even TikTok trends analyzing Foundation's psychohistory as if it were Nostradamus' prophecies. The lines blur further with franchises like Warhammer 40K, where the god emperor of mankind blends Caesar, Christ, and Lovecraft into a grimdark deity. These aren't just stories, they're belief systems in waiting, their symbols tattooed on skin, and their ethics debated in online forums. Yet as AI begins generating stories, who controls these new myths? Platforms like ChatGPT can already spin tales of digital messiahs or silicon apocalypses, but without human hunger for meaning, they risk becoming hollow parrots. The real test isn't whether AI can write a myth, but whether anyone will believe it. Ancient bards channeled gods, modern authors channel collective anxieties. Can algorithms replicate that alchemy, or will they merely repackage our own echoes? The answer might lie in how we, the audience, choose to anoint our storytellers. After all, every myth begins not with the teller, but with those ready to listen. From the Mesopotamian flood of Gilgamesh to Noah's Ark, from the hero's trials in the Epic of Hercules to Luke Skywalker's journey in Star Wars, certain stories echo across time and geography with eerie familiarity. Why do so many civilizations, separated by oceans and millennia, spin tales of cataclysmic floods, dying and rising gods, or underdog heroes triumphing against impossible odds? Scholars have long wrestled with this puzzle, and their answers reveal as much about us as the myths themselves. Joseph Campbell called it the monomyth, the idea that all hero stories follow a universal template, a call to adventure, a descent into the unknown, a transformative ordeal, and a return with wisdom. His theory, inspired by Jung's concept of archetypes, suggests these patterns are hardwired into human psychology, bubbling up from some collective subconscious. Think of it as a mental operating system, preloaded with story templates that every culture customizes. When the Maori speak of Moi fishing up islands or the Greeks tell of Perseus slaying Medusa, they're not copying each other, they're independently accessing the same primal script. But not everyone buys the monomyth as a psychic universal. Critics point to the Silk Road, the Mediterranean trade networks, and other ancient highways where stories hitchhiked alongside spices and silks. The flood myth, for instance, appears in Babylonian, Hebrew, and Mayan traditions, but did it arise separately, or did it spread through contact? The Aztecs' legend of the five suns, with its cycles of destruction and rebirth, bears uncanny resemblances to Hindu cosmology. Coincidence or evidence of a vast, interconnected storytelling web? The debate rages on, with some scholars mapping mythic DNA like linguists tracing word roots, while others insist these parallels prove nothing more than humanity's shared fascination with life's big questions. Yet the most provocative angle isn't how these patterns repeat, it's why they're so effective as tools of power. Take the hero's journey. When empires co-opt it, the hero becomes a king or conqueror, his victories framed as destiny. Alexander the Great didn't just invade Persia. He cast himself as a new Achilles, carrying Homer's Iliad as a blueprint. Centuries later, Napoleon would emulate Virgil's Aeneid, casting his rise as a heroic odyssey toward imperial glory. The monomyth in these hands isn't just a story, it's a psychological lever, priming people to see certain outcomes as fated. Flood myths, too, carry loaded implications. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods send the deluge to cleanse humanity's noise, a divine reboot. Fast forward to colonial America, where Puritan preachers used Noah's Ark to justify displacing native peoples, framing their arrival as a righteous new beginning. The recurring theme isn't just water, it's the idea that destruction paves the way for the rightful inheritors. Even today, climate disaster narratives often echo these tropes, with billionaires pitching Mars colonization as a modern ark for the chosen few. This raises an uncomfortable question. If myths are so malleable, who gets to control the narrative? Campbell's theory, for all its poetic appeal, risks glossing over the politics embedded in these tales. The hero of one culture is often the invader of another. The flood that cleanses one society may erase another's history. Recognizing these patterns isn't just academic, it's a survival skill in a world where stories still dictate who belongs, who rules, and who gets left behind. Because the deepest truth about universal myths isn't their sameness, but whose version of them we're taught to believe. Every mythmaker faces a crossroads. Do they serve the truth or shape it to serve power? George Orwell's 1984 laid bare the darkest path, a regime that didn't just rewrite history but erased the very concept of objective reality. Who controls the past controls the future. O'Brien sneers as he forces Winston to believe 2 + 2 = 5. This isn't just fiction, it's a warning about myths weaponized to gaslight entire societies. Stalin's airbrushed purges, North Korea's divine Kims, these are myths stripped of ethics, designed to enslave minds rather than inspire them. Yet contrast that with Nelson Mandela's Rainbow Nation. Facing a South Africa fractured by apartheid, he didn't deny brutal truths, he wove them into a new story of shared destiny. The Springboks rugby victory in 1995 wasn't just a game. It became a mythic moment where black and white South Africans cheered the same team, their chants dissolving decades of division. Mandela understood something Orwell's tyrants didn't. Ethical mythmaking isn't about erasing the past but redeeming it. The Rainbow Nation wasn't a lie, it was a bridge, inviting people to step into a story bigger than their scars. So where's the line between manipulation and responsibility? Consider how indigenous activists reclaim their creation stories not as folklore, but as evidence in land rights cases. When the Maori present Wakapapa genealogies in court, they're not distorting history, they're restoring voices that colonization tried to silence. These myths aren't tools of control but of restitution, rebalancing scales tipped by empires. Meanwhile, conspiracy theories like QAnon twist the human hunger for meaning into paranoid fantasy, replacing Mandela's bridges with Orwell's funhouse mirrors. The difference lies in direction. Toxic myths impose, they demand unquestioning belief, punishing doubt. Healthy myths invite, they acknowledge their own crafting, leaving room for questioning and growth. The Star-Spangled Banner began as a poem about war. Its mythic power grew when activists like Marian Anderson and Jimi Hendrix reinterpreted it, challenging America to live up to its own story. Ethical myths aren't static, they're conversations evolving as they're retold. This brings us to the most personal frontier, self-mythology. Every time someone reframes their struggles as a hero's journey, addicts becoming survivors, immigrants casting themselves as pioneers, they're not lying. They're harnessing myth's oldest power to transform fate into agency. The test isn't whether the story is flawless, but whether it expands possibilities instead of shrinking them. Because the ultimate ethical myth isn't the one told to us, but the one we dare to tell about ourselves. We don't just live our lives, we story them, stitching together memories and meaning until the chaos of days becomes something with shape, purpose, even destiny. This isn't just poetic whimsy, it's narrative psychology in action, the brain's compulsive need to turn raw experience into plot. And here's the kicker. The same tricks empires use to justify their rule, selective memory, heroic framing, symbolic rebirth, are the ones we use to make sense of our own messy histories. Think about how you introduce yourself at a party. That 2-minute version of your life isn't documentary. It's myth-making, emphasizing some chapters, the comeback, the epiphany, while downplaying others, the false starts, the luck. We're all Augustus in miniature, editing our personal Aeneids to cast ourselves as protagonists in an epic that makes sense. Take the redemptive arc, one of the most potent templates in the self-mythology toolkit. Researchers like Dan McAdams find that people who frame their lives as redemption stories, I was lost, then I found purpose, report higher life satisfaction, even when the facts are more complicated. A recovering addict becomes a counselor, not despite their past but because of it. A failed entrepreneur spins bankruptcy as the rock bottom that led to their true calling. This isn't delusion, it's sense-making, the same alchemy Roman emperors used when rebranding civil wars as divine trials. The difference, when empires do it, it's propaganda. When we do it, it's therapy. Yet the tools of self-reinvention are double-edged. Just as pharaohs chiseled unflattering rulers from temple walls, we practice mnemonic neglect, unconsciously shelving memories that don't fit our preferred narrative. Ever notice how childhood anecdotes get polished over time? The playground humiliation becomes a lesson in resilience. The aimless post-college years morph into a quest for authenticity. These edits aren't lies, they're mythic revisions, turning life's clutter into a hero's journey. The danger comes when the revision becomes dogma, when we cling so tightly to our story that we ignore facts that contradict it. That's how the self-made man forgets his mentors, or the tortured artist romanticizes self-destruction. Conscious self-mythologizing offers a way out. Instead of letting narratives happen to us, we can craft them with intention. Journaling exercises like Life as a Book, What's Your Title, Your Turning Points, reveal hidden themes. Role models aren't just inspirations, they're archetypes we can adapt. The healer, the rebel, the sage. Even setbacks can be reframed as mythic trials. Losing a job isn't failure, but the ordeal before the rebirth. The goal isn't to erase the past, but to repattern it, much like indigenous cultures renew creation stories through retelling. But beware the lure of mythic literalism, the trap of believing your own story too rigidly. History's worst tyrants weren't those who manipulated myths, but those who became them, mistaking their self-constructed roles for cosmic inevitability. On a personal level, this looks like the entrepreneur who can't pivot because it would betray their brand, or the activist so wedded to their martyr narrative they burn out allies. The healthiest myths, like the Navajo's Hajo walking in beauty, leave room for contradiction, for heroes who doubt, for victories that taste like ash. Because the most powerful story isn't the one that insists on its own perfection. It's the one that knows it's still being written. The moment myths harden into dogma, they become weapons sharpened not just to defend identities but to erase others. Consider ISIS rampage through Mosul in 2014, bulldozing Assyrian statues at the Mosul Museum. To the militants, these weren't relics of human heritage but shirk, idolatry demanding purification. Yet their fury wasn't random. It followed a grim playbook: justify destruction by cherry-picking hadiths about Prophet Muhammad's removal of idols from the Kaaba, then amplify the act through viral videos. This wasn't mere vandalism, it was mythic warfare, a calculated erasure of any history that challenged their claim to represent pure Islam. The irony. Many artifacts they destroyed, like the winged bulls of Nineveh, dated to civilizations that predated Islam by millennia. By obliterating them, ISIS wasn't defending faith. They were rewriting time itself, collapsing centuries into a single, sanctioned narrative. White supremacists wield similar tactics, plundering Norse sagas and twisting them into racial manifestos. The Valknut, a symbol linked to Odin's cult of the slain, becomes a tattoo for neo-Nazis. Runes stripped of their original meanings are repurposed as hate group insignia. These distortions aren't accidents. Their deliberate acts of mythic theft, severing symbols from context to serve a fabricated past. When Anders Breivik cited Templar myths before his massacre, or the Christchurch shooter invoked Saint Remigius in his manifesto, they weren't honoring tradition. They were grafting modern bigotry onto ancient frames, turning stories of heroism into warrants for terror. The Taliban's dynamiting of the Bamiyan Buddhas in 2001 reveals another layer: fear of pluralism. Those 6th century statues had stood for over a millennium, surviving Mongol invasions and shifting empires. Their destruction wasn't just about iconoclasm. It was a statement that Afghanistan's history began with their interpretation of Islam. By erasing pre-Islamic layers, they didn't just demolish stone. They severed a nation from its multicultural roots, enforcing a myth of cultural purity as fragile as it was violent. So how do we counter myths that kill? Blanket dismissals backfire, calling them fake only fuels persecution complexes. Instead, the antidote lies in recontextualization. Scholars like Ibn Warraq and Reza Aslan have exposed how extremists misquote texts, while archaeologists like Dr. Lamia Al-Gilani rebuilt Iraq's looted archives, proving heritage outlives tyranny. In Norway, heathen groups like the Asatrufellesskapet actively reclaim runes from racists, hosting public rituals that celebrate Norse myths as stories of resilience, not racial supremacy. But the most potent resistance comes from living counter-narratives. When Malala Yousafzai champions education as Islamic duty, or when Yazidi women testify about ISIS atrocities through ancient oral poetry, they're not just refuting extremism, they're offering better myths. Ones where courage isn't measured in corpses but in classrooms, where identity isn't a cage but a mosaic, because the opposite of a toxic myth isn't silence. It's a story so vivid, so human, that it drowns out the drums of dogma, and those stories, fragile as clay, enduring as stone, are the ones that outlast every attempt to bury them. After the wreckage of apartheid, South Africa faced a choice: vengeance or a story vast enough to hold both victims and perpetrators. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission didn't just document atrocities, it staged a ritual of reckoning where storytelling became the mortar to rebuild a shattered nation. Imagine a former police officer confessing to torture, not in a courtroom but before the woman whose son he killed, or a mother recounting her child's disappearance while the man responsible sat feet away, his face flickering between defiance and shame. These weren't trials, they were mythic encounters where raw testimony, spoken, wept, even sung, transformed private pain into collective catharsis. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, chairing the hearings, framed them as Ubuntu in action: I am because we are. The genius wasn't in forgiving the unforgivable, but in creating a new creation story where justice meant exposing wounds to the air, not sewing them shut with silence. Halfway across the world, Iceland took mythmaking even further, not to heal old divisions, but to prevent them. After their banks collapsed in 2008, trust in government evaporated like Arctic mist. So ordinary citizens, fishermen, teachers, even a sheep farmer crowdsourced a constitution on social media, weaving ancient sagas into modern law. They quoted the Althing, the Viking-era assembly where disputes were settled beneath open skies, to argue for transparency. References to Norse land spirits shaped environmental protections. This wasn't dry policymaking. It was democracy as collaborative storytelling, with each clause a stanza in Iceland's next epic. The draft even included a preamble written by a poet, because how a nation speaks itself into being matters as much as the rules it sets. What unites these experiments? Inclusive myth-making narratives that don't paper over conflict but make room for dissonance. Compare this to America's culture wars, where competing myths, founding fathers as saints or slaveholders, battle for monopoly. South Africa and Iceland suggest a third path, stories that acknowledge multiple truths without demanding uniformity. The Truth Commission's transcripts, published as truth books, didn't erase disagreement, they enshrined it as national text. Iceland's constitution drafters didn't purge Christian heritage to appease atheists, but threaded pagan and secular values into something uniquely Icelandic. The lesson for fractured societies: myths don't have to be weapons. They can be looms weaving frayed threads into stronger fabric. When Rwanda's post-genocide government revived Gacaca courts, traditional community hearings, they blended tribal justice with modern accountability. Indigenous Australians use yarning circles to bridge indigenous and settler perspectives, grounding policy debates in shared storytelling. Even Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission borrowed South Africa's model, but with a twist. Survivors of residential schools didn't just testify. They taught, reintroducing ceremonies like smudging to bureaucrats who'd banned them for generations. The quiet revolution here isn't in forgetting the past but restoring it, not moving on, but moving with carrying grief and hope in the same breath. Because the most durable myths aren't the ones that demand blind faith, but those sturdy enough to hold contradiction, compassionate enough to make space for the enemy's humanity. And that's where our journey through the mythic blueprints of power leaves us, not at an ending, but at a threshold where the next story waits to be told. Myths no longer live on clay tablets or temple walls. They pulse through algorithms, viral tweets, and geopolitical propaganda, wielding the same power to unite or divide as they did in Babylon or Rome. The difference: today's myths spread at the speed of light, their consequences unfolding before we even recognize the stories we've absorbed. Consider how QAnon hijacked the archetype of the hero's journey, casting its followers as enlightened warriors battling a shadowy cabal. The narrative wasn't just persuasive, it was immersive, blending apocalyptic fervor with the dopamine hits of social media engagement. This isn't conspiracy theory, it's conspiracy mythology, a revival of ancient patterns dressed in digital camouflage. The same storytelling tools Augustus used to sanctify his rule, simplified villains, prophetic destiny, us versus them binaries, now fuel everything from political cults to brand loyalties, proving that mythic blueprints aren't relics. They're operating systems, and they're running silently in the background of our lives. Yet for all their dangers, myths remain indispensable. Ukraine's resistance against Russia offers a masterclass in mythic resilience. When President Zelensky declared, "I need ammunition, not a ride," he wasn't just refusing evacuation. He was stepping into the archetype of the defiant king who stands with his people. Ukrainian artists transformed Russian tanks into canvases for folkloric motifs, merging the Cossack rebel Haidamaki with modern memes. These weren't just acts of defiance, they were narrative warfare, countering Putin's imperial myths with stories of grassroots heroism. The lesson: myths can be cages, but they can also be keys. The corporate world has perfected this duality. Apple's Think Different campaign didn't sell computers. It sold rebellion, co-opting the myth of the underdog to mask its trillion-dollar dominance. Meanwhile, Patagonia's founder declared Earth its only shareholder, wrapping capitalist pragmatism in the cloak of environmental stewardship. Both are mythic maneuvers, but one obscures power while the other attempts to redefine it. The line between manipulation and inspiration has never been thinner or more consequential. Disinformation thrives where critical myth literacy fails. When ancient rulers rewrote origin stories, their subjects lacked the tools to question the edits. Today, we drown in narratives but starve for discernment. Finland's education system fights back by teaching media myth busting as early as kindergarten, training children to spot archetypal manipulation in ads and political slogans. Their strategy echoes the Sami tradition of yoik songs that can't be owned or falsified, only passed down with accountability. The urgency isn't just about resisting toxic myths, it's about reclaiming their generative power. Indigenous climate activists don't reject science. They frame data through stories like the Navajo Haja, where balance isn't a policy goal but a sacred covenant. Architects in Rotterdam design flood-resistant neighborhoods inspired by Bengali chars, floating villages shaped by ancestral flood myths. These aren't nostalgic gestures, they're proof that the oldest stories might hold the newest solutions. So how do we navigate this landscape without succumbing to cynicism or credulity? Start by asking whose harmony a myth serves and who pays its dissonant price. When a narrative claims inevitability, trace its seams. When it demands uniformity, listen for the silenced counterpoint, because the most potent antidote to weaponized myths isn't disbelief, it's better myths. Ones that leave room for complexity, honor plural truths, and like the best ancient tales remind us that power isn't just about controlling stories, but sharing them. From the moment Babylonian priests chiseled Marduk's triumph into clay to Silicon Valley's glossy origin stories, one thread binds empires across time: the audacity to rewrite creation myths in their own image. But here's the twist: every act of mythic erasure sparks a counter-story. When Spanish colonizers burned Mayan codices, scribes smuggled fragments into Catholic texts, hiding prophecies in saints' lives. Enslaved Africans in the Americas wove Yoruba orishas into Catholic saints, turning forced conversion into covert survival. Today, the same dance plays out in hashtags and algorithms. Big tech spins tales of connecting the world while shadow-banning voices that disrupt their narrative. Yet activists repurpose those very platforms to amplify indigenous land struggles or labor strikes. The battleground isn't just history books or server farms. It's the primal human need to ask whose story gets to be sacred. This isn't about ancient history. It's about the stories we breathe in daily, the national anthems that gloss over genocide, the corporate slogans masking exploitation, even the self-myths we construct to justify our choices. The Romanovs claimed divine right while peasants starved. Modern influencers peddle hustle culture as gospel while gig workers collapse from exhaustion. The mechanism hasn't changed, only the stage, yet resistance blooms in the cracks. Maori filmmakers use CGI to resurrect ancestral landscapes Disney tried to trademark. Black gamers mod video games to center pre-colonial African empires. A Navajo linguist stitches Nas Amar's footage with Dene Star lore, reclaiming the cosmos from Elon Musk's frontier fantasies. These aren't just acts of defiance, they're mythic remixes, proving that no empire, no algorithm can fully monopolize imagination. So here's your invitation: interrogate the myths you've inherited. When a politician invokes destiny, ask who's left out of the tale. When a brand promises revolution in a smartphone, wonder what labor lies buried in the packaging. And most urgently, question the stories you tell yourself. Are you the hero of your own journey or a side character in someone else's script? The most subversive act isn't just rejecting toxic myths, but daring to author better ones. Now it's your turn. Drop a comment sharing which myths shape your worldview, the ones you cling to, the ones you're unlearning. Hit subscribe if you're ready to peel back more layers of the stories that rule our world. Because the next chapter isn't written yet, and it's ours to draft.